We all know that the gospel of Jesus Christ is a serious matter and always needs to be treated with respect and reverence. But to be honest, sometimes it seems a little comical. And don't you think God has a good sense of humor? I mean, you read today's gospel story and think about what it looks like. Jesus walks into a banquet and he sees all the guests jockeying to get the best seat in the house. One says, that's my seat there next to the host. And another says, oh, no, that's my seat. No, you're mistaken. That's my seat. The host told me that's where I was supposed to sit. And the other says, oh, no, he told me I was supposed to sit there. And someone else comes up and says, no, you're both wrong. That's my seat today. You can just see this comical scene playing out in the gospel story. Now, something we need to remember about this story is that it takes place in a society of patronage. And in this kind of society, there's a whole level of relationships from top to bottom. Everyone has a place. The person at the top is called the patron, and the persons below the patron are called the clients. So the patron can give favors to all his clients. And the clients in return are supposed to give favors to the patron. So there's this relationship between everybody. And the clients themselves might be patrons to someone who is at a lower situation than them. So the whole society is graded sort of from top to bottom, from the emperor on down. So in today's gospel story, we see this play out in the scene that we're reading about. Everyone wants to be as high up on the social scale as they can be. The patron is at the head table, and his most favored clients are sitting next to him. And the further you are away from the head table, the lower your status is. So, of course, you want to jockey for the best seat that you can get. Everybody is going to notice where you're sitting. Well, eventually everyone finds their seat or is assigned to a seat, and they start the meal, and the patron stands up and acknowledges Jesus and says, "Give us a few words, Rabbi." So Jesus stands up and speaks. He says, "Let me tell you a parable. When you come to a banquet, don't take the seat of honor in case the host might come to you and ask you to step down and you'd be embarrassed. Instead, take the lowest seat and you might be asked to step up, and then you would be honored. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." What Jesus is saying to them is that this game that you're playing isn't really working. You're playing musical chairs, trying to get ahead, trying to build up your ego, but what you really need to do is to work on yourself. If you want to become an authentic human being, humble yourself. Let go of your ego. And if you humble yourself, eventually you will be lifted up. Of course, it's not that easy. When we try to be humble, then we end up being proud of our humility. And that's sort of paradoxical. But often, humility isn't something that we choose, but is something that's thrust upon us. We're humbled. And then we begin to find out who we really are. The Franciscan monk and writer Richard Rohr says that life has two halves. There are two halves to our lives. In the first half of life, we build a container for our lives. We learn a trade, or we get a degree, we start a career, we make a family, we start accumulating possessions. And we're focused on externals, on labels, on appearances, on judgment. And that's what we have to do in order to build up ourselves as human beings. We're building the container for our lives. We're creating our identity. And then Richard Rohr says, somewhere in the middle of life, something happens, some kind of a fall, a death maybe, a split maybe, a failure of some kind, a crisis. And when that happens, then we move into the second half of life where we begin to work on the contents that go into the container. We learn who we really are. We learn how to be more generous and more accepting and more wise. We learn to become more humble. In 1999, I was called to be the vicar of a small Episcopal church on the coast of Oregon. I was reluctant. It didn't seem like a good fit for me. It was a small church in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't think it was a good fit for my talents. In fact, I had a pretty high opinion of myself as a priest. I thought that I was bound to be the rector of a big church and to be admired and to be successful. And here I was in this little church in the middle of nowhere. Well, we got there, and it did not go well. 2 weeks after I arrived, the church secretary quit. And then people started leaving the church because it was pretty clear that I was not the same as the previous vicar whom they loved, and who was very conservative and anti-homosexual. And then, after 2 years, it became clear that the church didn't have enough money to pay my salary. So I had to go find another job to supplement my pay at the church. And then the former secretary, who was still a member and part of the church and clearly did not like me, accused me of sexual harassment during those first 2 weeks back at the beginning of my ministry. Well, a charge like that is explosive. The bishop was notified, and immediately the bishop came down and made an investigation. And what he concluded was that the charges had no merit, and he wrote a letter to the church saying that I find that there's no merit to these charges and they're going to be dropped. So he cleared me of the charges, but the damage was done. The whole church was in shock. Church secretary and her supporters left the church, but really we didn't know what to do. And we called that next year in the church the fallow year, because we didn't try anything new. We just did what we were supposed to do, the routine things, because we were all trying to figure out what was going on. And for myself, I was devastated. I couldn't believe that I had been charged with something so serious, sexual misconduct. You know, in the Episcopal Church, you can lose your job, you can lose your whole career just from an accusation like that. So I was just stunned. Luckily, Katie had my back, and she was my rock and got me through. And I went to a therapist for over a year to try to work through this. And I had to completely rethink who I was as a person and as a priest. And I came to realize that I wasn't as great as I thought I was. What I learned was that I'm just a small church pastor. I'm not a spiritual giant or an up-and-coming bishop or a theological genius. I'm just me. And when I began to let that soak in and quit trying to be someone I'm not, I found that I could be much more authentic. I could just be myself. And I discovered that I like people, and most people anyway like me. And that's my gift. That's who I am. So what happened was that God humbled me so that I could be the person that God made me to be. You know, when I think of Jesus' life, I think of the 40 days in the wilderness where he fasted and prayed and was tempted by the devil. And I think that that period was his crisis. That was his fall, or his experience that changed everything for him. He was humbled in the experience, and he came out of it knowing just who he was and what he was called to do. So he entered the second half of his life when he was only 30. Well, some people never make it into the second half of life. Some people are never humbled. They go through life with an ego the size of a pumpkin, and they never learn anything new. They never change. But for those of us who have experienced a fall, or a failure, or a crisis, we know what Jesus was talking about. We've left the first half of life behind, and we're in the second half. And now we know all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted.